Hello, my name is Anastasiia, and I'm a master's student at Georgia State University. My presentation is titled Catcalling as Dispositional Misogyny, Locating Catcalling Within the Discourse on Patriarchy Enforcing Speech. And perhaps you have seen someone, most likely a woman, be subject to catcalling. Or perhaps you have been subjected to this type of verbal street harassment yourself. Catcalling includes unsolicited complimentary comments, whistles, and other types of exclamations, explicitly or implicitly sexual, directed at passing by strangers in public places. Compared to other types of verbal street harassment, catcalling may appear to be more benign, but this, as I suggest in this work, is just part of what makes catcalling such a particularly insidious tool of the patriarchy. A conclusion for which I argue is that catcalling is best captured as its own category of patriarchy enforcing speech, the category I choose to call dispositional misogyny. But the more important theme in this work is to arrive at some greater conceptual clarity of the social phenomenon of catcalling, such as to highlight that it is in fact a more pernicious kind of gender-based oppressive speech than even openly misogynistic speech. According to Kate Mann's analysis, misogyny is paradigmatic of a patriarchal society in which men, as a social group, hold dominance over women. And individual misogynistic acts are properly understood as reflections of systematic power relations rather than isolated cases of ill judgment. There are several key features that are characteristic of misogyny: hostility, coerciveness, and punishment. Whereas misogyny is primarily concerned with the punishment and coercion of bad women, sexist speech takes as its goal the propagation of the overall patriarchal narrative. Sexism is conceptually distinct, for it doesn't coerce, but rather provides rational ground for misogyny, manifesting itself in assumptions, theories, and stereotypes. Drawing on Mann's analysis of manifestations of patriarchy, and in particular the contrast between misogyny and sexism, Louise Richardson Self suggests a similar scheme for understanding patriarchy enforcing speech. That is, that there is sexist speech, which is a kind of oppressive speech, but it is not hostile, coercive, or punishing, and that there is misogynistic speech, which is. But in my work, to which I'm alluding here more than summarizing really, I argue that catcalling doesn't neatly fit within the account of patriarchy enforcing speech presented by Richardson Self, as it neither is merely sexist nor openly misogynistic. In particular, I argue that catcalling as such is neither hostile nor punitive, which makes it unfit to be categorized as misogynistic speech. At the same time, catcalling is distinctly coercive. While it doesn't take coercion as its main underlying aim, it nevertheless produces changes in the behaviors of women in two ways. First, by compelling them to act so as to avoid future instances of catcalling, and second, and more immediately, by compelling them to act such as to avoid facing open misogyny. Given that on Richardson Self's account, sexist speech cannot be coercive without becoming an instance of misogyny, catcalling doesn't fit within the category of sexist speech either. So let us first examine the ways in which catcalling departs from the above stated characterization of misogynistic speech. Clearly, typical catcalling remarks lack the face hostility, which is a necessary attribute of misogynistic speech. Consider typical catcalling comments. Hey, beautiful. We love you. We love you. Don't be nervous. You're one good-looking lady. Very nice. I should note that often people use the term catcalling to describe all forms of verbal street harassment of sexual nature. Part of my task here is to highlight the distinctive kind of verbal street harassment which I call catcalling, a kind of speech which men use to show their approval of women's appearance. On the very face of it, catcalling then doesn't convey hostility. Quite the opposite. The catcallers consider it to be their way of complimenting a woman for doing a good job at pleasing their eyes. As complimentary in nature, catcalling doesn't appear to be punitive in the same way as misogynistic speech is. And honking his horn, yelling "hot baby," the driver doesn't intend to convey to a woman that she transgressed social norms appropriate to a woman's role. Rather, in this case, the driver expresses his approval of the woman's appearance. As women are expected to live up to the norms of feminine appearance so as to please the male gaze, a catcalling expression coming from a man serves to show that a woman is successfully complying with the patriarchal norms and should continue to do so. If catcalling isn't overtly misogynistic, then perhaps we could consider it to be a type of sexist speech. After all, women are disproportionately targeted by catcalling by living up to the feminine ideals, which are part of the sexist cultural narrative. While at first a seemingly reasonable characterization for catcalling, an important distinction clarified by Mann and Richards himself is that sexist speech doesn't occur as behavior. So the remainder of this work is focused on showing two ways in which catcalling is distinctly coercive. And here I depart from an understanding of coercion only as the intended function of speech, to take into consideration the actual changes in behavior which catcalling produces in women. Among other options, in order to avoid being catcalled, women may change their style of dress, their way of walking, or the path they choose to take. Some women choose to wear noise-canceling headphones or simply play loud music in their headphones in order to avoid hearing unwelcome compliments. It is important to recognize here that women's change in behavior is not typically produced by any single instance of catcalling. Instead, women come to anticipate this kind of verbal street harassment as they exit their homes because of its frequent and continuous essence. By observing the patterns of catcalling activity, a woman can make more reliable predictions and thus change her behavior more effectively. For example, having observed that presenting herself in a more feminine way leads to an increased frequency of catcalling, a woman may intentionally choose to wear less typical feminine clothes or to adjust her overall way of presenting herself, such as to avoid an asking for it look. To sum up what I have been suggesting up till this point, first, catcalling appears to be benign. Catcallers intend for it to be complimentary and approving rather than hostile or punitive. Second, catcalling serves as an indication that a woman is living up to the social ideals of feminine appearance, and that characterizes a woman as a good woman. Third, catcalling typically leads women to change their behavior in various ways, such as to avoid future instances of catcalling to the extent that they can. So now there is a question. If catcalling is complimentary, indicating that a woman doesn't need to change her behavior before she has successfully lived up to the feminine ideal of appearance, why do women tend to change their behavior in an effort to avoid being catcalled? My answer to this question brings to the fore the second way in which catcalling is coercive. Catcalling doesn't simply aim to reinforce the women's compliance with the norms of feminine appearance, but also with the norms of appropriate response to catcalling. As I have stated before, the likelihood of catcalling can be predicted by observing relevant patterns. But this in part comes with the recognition that catcalling takes place in the larger context of gendered social norms that impose certain ideals on the appearance of women. But the ideals of feminine appearance are not the only kind of social prescriptions implicated in catcalling encounters. Women are expected to acknowledge that they have paid attention to the catcalling comment and to respond to it in a grateful manner, which is taken to be an appropriate response to compliments more generally. A failure to do so immediately strips a woman of her status as a good woman and transforms her into a bad one. Catcalling, then, is a kind of speech which is dispositionally misogynistic. It is dispositional misogyny because, in itself, catcalling does not indicate hostility or overt threat. Far from it, catcalling is directed at initially good women who comply with the social norms of ideal feminine appearance. Yet, insofar as a woman fails to provide an immediate appropriate response, she is transformed into a bad woman and thus a target for misogyny. The appropriate response required from women is self-eliminating, such that the response is meant to be friendliness, to be interpreted as the appreciation of catcalling comments. Thus, women are expected to enjoy catcalling, to enjoy dispositional misogyny. Any diversion from an expected type of response, which indicates women's enjoyment and with this compliance with patriarchal norms, leads to her subversion of such social norms and thus lays grounds for open misogyny. I shall stop here due to our time constraints, but I'd like to briefly mention that in the later parts of this work, I treat the issues of women's observers and even confidants' failure to efficiently respond to catcalling instances. My explication and analysis of these failures further highlight the pernicious nature of catcalling, which itself is due to the hidden dispositional misogyny that it harbors. Misogyny, which is always lurking there, is the threat of patriarchal punishment, even in the sweetest words of patriarchal approval.